Welcome to the Movement Upgraded podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jen Hostler, licensed physical therapist and certified strength and mobility coach. Here you can expect to hear about all things movement. The Movement Upgraded podcast is a blend of the science of strength training, rehab, and mobility, mixed with the personal and professional experience to provide you with the steps you need to keep your body pain-free and moving well, so you can do what you love forever. Welcome back to the Movement Upgraded podcast. Today, we are chatting about periods, and we're chatting about them because I would love to normalize period talk a little bit more. I would love us to have more conversations about our periods. I would love us to be able to say the word period and not say my time of the month or anti-flow arrived or a menstrual cycle. It's a period, and we use tampons and pads, and we should be able to say those things out loud. I feel like I grew up in a time, so I'm a millennial, and I feel like growing up, it was very much like, it was a women's issue. Women just kind of have your periods, and you do so in silence, and you hide your tampon when you're going to change it, and it's this awkward thing. I think it's all bullshit. Women are the majority of the population. There are more women than men in the world, and for a large part of our lives, we are menstruating. And I just think that it's science. It needs to be addressed and considered and talked about, right? So the reason this all came up and we're doing this podcast today is because a few weeks ago, but by the time I get this launched, I think it will be a few weeks ago, I was having a particularly rough go at the day one of my period. So my period had started that morning, which meant that it woke me up. So when I start my periods, I tend to have a little insomnia in the mornings. Not always, but if I have other odds stacked against me, like I'm a little bit more stressed, I will typically be this way anyways. So I've been a little bit more stressed lately. And on top of that, I started my period. So I woke up early, couldn't fall back asleep. So that always sets me up for not the best day because I always have a bunch of brain fog and I'm highly affected by the amount of sleep I get or don't. And then I just started my period and just felt like I got hit by a brick wall. It was just like not a good period, lots of cramps, severe bloating. I just didn't want to do anything. You don't feel the best. How could you? You're bleeding out of your vagina. So let's just I don't know, think about things in that realm because that's what's happening. So it's one of those things that I wanted to curl up in a ball for the rest of the day, but I had this whole list of tasks that I had to do. And luckily for me, I'm at a place in my life where I have changed my schedule to be a little bit more conducive for my life. And one of the big reasons behind me wanting to get ownership of my schedule as a business owner was very much because in my previous job, so I had a regular physical therapy job my first year out. I worked a little bit less 9 to 5 in my next job. And finally, I think 5 years out of PT school, I'm at a point where I'm creating more of a schedule that's conducive to the lifestyle I want to live. And I'm doing that specifically because there's no flexibility. And when you are a woman who is menstruating and you are dealing with a monthly cycle, you don't feel the same every week. And in fact, there are some days where you feel really like trash. And I have a very consistent period, but it'll fluctuate between 1 to 3 days depending on the stress. And lately I've been more stressed. So I can't always pick a day and schedule my appointments around it knowing that my period is going to start that day because it doesn't always. And so I wanted a little bit more flexibility, and my periods pretty consistently start in the mornings now. So I've really shifted my schedule. And so luckily that time a couple weeks ago, I was in a situation where I didn't have to go to work right away, which was so helpful and I was so thankful. But I always have a ton of admin work and emails and things to still get done on the side. And I have a pretty tight schedule where I don't have a ton of flexibility, but I still have it. So I'm at that point where I'm super, super thankful for that. And I know not everybody is, which is kind of why I wanted to talk about this today. But because of that, I was sitting on the couch thinking how I needed to get done. I needed to get up. I needed to get some stuff done. And I was just so frustrated with feeling like trash. And it's really annoying because I can have these set of things that I want to do and accomplish. My body's like, hey, by the way, like we're going to feel like garbage, and it's going to feel like this octopus inside of your uterus is just wrangling your insides. That was literally the description I gave to Ryan that morning. And he was like, that is very descriptive. I was like, I mean, the way that I originally think of it is like a snake. You know how like snakes just like take their prey and just like wind themselves around their prey and choke them to death first? If you didn't know, now you do. We had a snake in my 8th grade class, and the teacher would feed it and you could watch that happen, and I hated it. But that is what happened. So I imagine a snake, but it's not just like one area. So that's why I use the octopus example where they have 8 tentacles. That's like what I think of, and it's just like writhing and like squeezing my insides with each one of those tentacles. So there's your very descriptive example of what it's like to be on period day 1, for me at least that day. And so because I was not feeling that great and I was really frustrated, I very often will try to talk about things on Instagram that I feel like help normalize them, which is kind of what I'm doing in this podcast. And one of those things is the fact that we have periods. We have very different sets of, not a set of bodies, like we're not an entirely different body, but in many ways it can feel like we're operating in different bodies depending on the week that we are in. And I basically just said, like, it's asinine that we as women in our childbearing years, women who menstruate, we are going in to our normal jobs, just like going about our daily lives pretending like we aren't miserable and in pain and wanting to be curled up in a ball all day. And it's really hard. It's very frustrating. And I don't feel like anybody was talking about this. I honestly, growing up, like it was not discussed, and we just go about our normal lives and we suffer in silence. And part of that ends up giving us this superpower of being able to tolerate a bunch of bullshit. But like, it's a superpower that I wish women didn't have to deal with. I don't think it's fair for us. And I think it's asinine that we just don't discuss these things with each other. One of the things, that I think we can do to address this is literally just start discussing our periods. And one of the things that I have done is in the past recent years is, I will tell Ryan pretty much everything that's going on and how I'm feeling. And to some, it might sound like complaining. In some ways, it probably is. And but you know, I think this is a burden that we don't need to carry on our own. Like I just don't think we do. And men will never understand. Anybody who does not have a menstrual cycle will never understand what it actually is like to go through that, because there are some very large changes that happen in our bodies. It's not just you get your period and you're cramping and you're bleeding. Like, yeah, maybe that's 1 week out of the month, but there's also other changes that happen in the different phases of our cycles too. And I think being able to talk about these things is really important. And I actually make it like a purpose to bring this up into my sessions with most of the people that I work with. I work typically, like most of the people I work with are women. And so, they're women and they're active women. So when we're active, like our menstrual cycle is going to change some of our activity a little bit, and paying attention to it's actually extra important because there are changes in our performance, which we're going to talk about today actually, because I think being armed with knowledge is part of it. So there's 2 things that I really want to do with this podcast today. And one of them is going to be normalize talking about our periods and talking about our menstrual cycles. If you are a dude, if you are like the one of 3 dudes who listen to this podcast, then, and you are in the fitness realm, like you're a coach, I would really like you to learn about menstrual cycles a little bit more. And I would also really like you to bring this up with your clients or learn how to create a safe place for them to talk about their menstrual cycle, because you need to understand where they are in their cycles to give them some education about their fitness, because it actually does impact us. And there are some behavior changes that we can and should do to help us not feel so impacted by these cycles, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today. But just being able to talk about that's really important. And I have a couple training clients that I've worked with very consistently for the past couple of years, and I see them on a regular basis every single week. And I will watch their strength go up and down based on what's going on. And we always have those conversations if they're not feeling the best. Well, did you fuel? Did you hydrate? Did you sleep well? Okay, where are you at in your menstrual cycle? Because that also can affect it. And those things are important. And if you are not having that conversation with your trainer, or you're a trainer and you're not having that conversation with your clients and they are clients who menstruate, it's really important to acknowledge and have that conversation. So I want to talk about this because I want us to talk about it, right? I don't want women to suffer in silence anymore. I think part of the reason that we don't want to bring this up and chat about it is because it's almost like another thing that's used, that's weaponized against us as this reason that women can't do things. We are weak, and we complain. And it is fucking annoying. I'm tired of it. I'm sure you are too. And I would like to validate that for you. But, we're not weak. In fact, the fact that we deal with all of this and suffer in silence just proves that no, we're not weak. We're not anything other than we deal with a lot of bullshit. And I think some of the things that I see portrayed on social media about women just like being so dramatic and exaggerating and emotional and all of these things, because men are not emotional, by the way, because they've done a really good job at making it sound like anger is not an emotion, which is a whole nother conversation for a different day. But a lot of these things that are portrayed from or about women are like women just reach their wits' end quickly because we deal with so much bullshit. Like, we're dealing with a lot. And if you haven't recognized that as a woman, I just want to like validate that for you and really kind of think back about how your physiology changes. If you aren't sure about your physiology, we'll talk about tracking, but like your physiology is changing. You're dealing with constantly changing and being this dynamic living creature in a world that expects you to perform 100% the exact same every single day. It is a world that is meant for men who don't have changes in their lives. And part of, I think, why women get so frustrated is because we cannot operate in this world that was created by men for men. And we just have fluctuations. The crazy thing is that we still get done just as much, if not more, than most men while we bleed out of our vaginas. Like, while we're bleeding for a week of the month, every single month, while we are going through these fluctuations. And, I think that's a big reason why women don't want to bring this up and talk about this, is because we don't want to be viewed at as less than or weak per se. So I think that we can turn that on its head by talking about this. And even if it's just talking about it to your other women friends who are menstruating, like going through and talking about it helps to normalize it, and it helps us feel like we're not alone. Because when I shared this on Instagram and I shared like how asinine it was that we just like go and operate in a world where we're like dying inside but nobody knows, and we have to put this like front on, and unfortunately, a lot of us get really good at it. I was really good at it. My first year in DPT, out of DPT school in my first clinic, I was absolutely miserable. Every single day towards the end, I was crying on my way to work. I would cry a lot on the weekends. Like, I was just really, really upset and frustrated, and I felt stuck. But my patients, when I finally told them I was leaving that place, they were all like, we had no idea you were so unhappy. And I think that's a problem, but also it shows that like that is a superpower that I had to develop, because I have to pretend. We have to play this game of pretend. It's completely fucking exhausting. And that's one of the reasons I ended up in the situation I did, so miserable, is because we have to do that as women. And I don't think we have to, but that's just become like the norm. And because we suffer in silence, then we don't discuss this to each other, because it's just one of those things that's taboo to talk about. But it shouldn't be fucking taboo. Like, it is every woman who is in their childbearing years who menstruates goes through these cycles and these hormonal changes. Even if you're on birth control, by the way, you still have fluctuations in your hormones. So you might not have the periods and the miserableness, but you're still going to have changes in your body. And it can be really helpful to track those things. So that's the first reason that I really wanted to bring this up. I want us to talk about it a little bit more. I want you to not be the only one that's burdened with carrying this. I want you to talk about this if you are in a relationship with somebody who does not menstruate. Talk about this to them so they can understand, because it's the only way they're going to, and they can do their due diligence and start to learn on their own too. But I think it can be helpful for us to just talk about it more. Talk about this with your friends. Talk about this with your moms and grandmas so you can see what their situation was like, so you can get a feel for what is like for the genetics that you've been passed down. What was their menopause situation like, and when did that happen? Those are things to talk about, and those are things to help normalize, and they're not things that I experience as this normal conversation that we have, even though it should be, so we can prepare the generation below us for what they're going to go through. So those are the things that reason I want to talk about it. And also because, again, I want you to not feel like you're alone. We always think we're the only ones. We always think we are, and we almost never are. How many billions of people are in the world, and we think we're the only ones struggling with a problem? It's silly to think that way. Almost everybody does. So I just want to bring that up so that we can normalize it and feel a little bit more connected. Social connections are one of the biggest parts of wellness, right? And this is a way for us to connect because it's kind of like silly for us to be suffering in silence, not discussing it. And if you start to just talk about it out loud, you'll realize like how, not always, but a lot of times it's just really validating to be able to discuss this with other people and help normalize it. And that is how we pave a better future for the generations that are coming after us. To help normalize those conversations will just help them be able to have the normal conversation, and maybe help less of them suffer in silence. And maybe, who knows what can happen. I mean, I think the day after I posted this on Instagram, Spain, I believe, like wrote a law or passed a law that is giving women 3 days of menstrual leave per month. And I guarantee those women are still going to get more done, or just as much done as the men who don't get those days. So that is just like the one note that I wanted to bring up. The second reason I wanted to bring this up is because understanding your menstrual cycle and looking at it can help you make changes and intentionally do things that can reduce how much of the suffering that you experience. So one of the things that I have noticed personally in my own cycle is that tracking has really given me a like sense of mental sanity, because I would be so frustrated on all these changes, and I would get so honed in and zoomed in on the moment that I would have no idea that I was going through the same cycle every single month. And how could you, like, if you are changing so much? And I have talked about this before, but I suffered from like really significant body image struggles when I was younger, from a lot of different reasons. And I started tracking finally and realized like those are significantly affected by where I'm at in my cycle. And this is the same thing for most of the women that I work with. So the second reason I wanted to bring this up is just because I would love for more women to be able to track their cycles, to just be empowered with a little bit more knowledge about their menstrual cycle. So let's talk real quick about what a menstrual cycle is. If you didn't know, haven't had the basic sex ed, because sex ed sucks in our country because we're afraid of words like tampons and periods and sex, even though they are very important to talk about and normalize. But there are basically two phases in our menstrual cycle. Day one of our menstrual cycle, or the beginning of our menstrual cycle, is when we begin bleeding. That's the day one of our period. That day until we ovulate is known as our follicular phase. And this is when we have really high estrogen. It's called our low hormone phase. It is basically the phase of our month. It usually lasts almost 2 weeks, is pretty much when we are most like men. So we perform really well. We're recovering from exercise usually a little bit better. We have a higher pain tolerance. So like our pain thresholds change. We have high insulin sensitivity. sensitivity. So that means we are going to be more prone to utilizing carbs as fuel. So you may notice, by the way, that your cravings change based off of the cycle that you're in. Not the cycle, but the phase that you're in, because our physiology changes and our metabolism changes on what we prefer to utilize for fuel. We prefer carbs in our follicular phase. And so this is when we typically can train hard and push it. And I usually tell the people that I work with, this is when we have a little bit more leeway with kind of fucking up our general self-care items. So if you are not sleeping as well, or you're a little bit more stressed, it's less likely to affect you than in your luteal phase. So luteal phase is going to be from when you ovulate until your period. So this is the second half of your cycle. This is we ovulate, and then our body temperature increases, and we have higher progesterone and not as much estrogen. So this is our higher hormone phase. The main thing that happens here is our body temperature increasing, which means it's easier for us to overheat and get exhaustion in exercise. And also we have lower plasma volume, which means it's really important to pay extra attention to electrolytes. And this is why one of the reasons that I actually love Liquid IV. They had reached out to me a long time ago to be an affiliate with them, and I finally realized, like, being in Florida, how much I sweat, how much I don't hydrate, and started paying more attention to that probably a year or two ago, and noticed that definitely in the second half of my cycle, if I had a Liquid IV while I was exercising, so I would fill that up in my water bottle, or in the middle of exercise if it was a longer session or it was really hot outside in Florida, I would do way better, and my performance wouldn't be impacted so much. And it's been fucking awesome. And this is what I mean by, like, being able to be empowered and knowledge and have knowledge about your cycle, where you can make changes so that you don't get so pissed at your body. If you're like me and you had this, like, not great relationship with your body growing up, or now still, and every time it just doesn't perform like you want, you get really frustrated, or it doesn't look like you want, you get frustrated. And some of the frustration can be taken out if we just get a little more clinical, and you can't get clinical and objective until you have the knowledge to do so. And that's kind of why the other reason that I wanted to create this podcast. So in the luteal phase, so in that second half of our cycle, our sweat rate is also increased. So we're sweating more, likely because that's how we regulate our body temperature, and our body temperature is increased. So all of that to be said, those are reasons that we are not we're not going to perform as well in the gym. Typically, this is when we're not, we have more odds stacked against us to perform well, right? And we also metabolize fats a little bit more. So our metabolism shifts a little bit to metabolizing fats instead of carbs, because our insulin sensitivity goes down. And because insulin sensitivity goes down, we're more prone to, like, sugar crashes. And if we have, like, cortisol, which also affects our blood sugar and our insulin, then we're more likely to have emotional instability, right? Because that also happens as a byproduct of, like, a sugar crash. And oh man, was this, like, one of the pivotal things for me that I keep learning over and over again. Getting grumpy and feeling like a whiny toddler, or just feeling like you're brain fog and you can't concentrate. If you're in the luteal phase, just eat a carb and see if it helps. And everybody kept saying this, and I was like, I came from a little bit more of one of those, I went down a very orthorexic type of eating pattern, where I was very into clean foods and health and functional medicine, almost to the point where it was really unhealthy. And because of that, I read and listened to a lot of different quote unquote specialists who were always saying how bad that being carb adapted was. And they also pushed a lot of the fasting and keto and things like that. And unfortunately, most of them are men, and those types of diets are not as great for women. We are more sensitive to energy availability issues. So if we are not eating enough, our bodies kind of revolt a little bit more than men. And if you think about this primally speaking, it kind of makes sense, because we have hormones and we are responsible for taking care of bearing and birthing and raising children and breastfeeding them. And so, it just kind of makes a little bit more sense. It's really annoying, but this is also why a lot of women cannot do the same diets their husbands do, and they crash or it doesn't work for them. And it's a lot of those reasons are because of our menstrual cycle and our hormone makeup. So all that to be said, we in luteal phase, we end up metabolizing a little bit more fats. We also have a slight increase in our metabolism. So there are some studies to show that we burn an extra 100 to 300 calories per day. It's different. All of the stuff that I'm telling you is very individual and is changed. So this is kind of the general gist. And I'm going to give you some of my personal experience and those that I work with. But in the end, like knowing that this is common or this can happen, I want you to take this information and then I want you to just see for yourself after you track on your own things, because that's what's really going to matter. It's just, I hope what the most that you get out of this is some very basic things of, okay, in luteal phase, I want to pay more attention to my water intake, and I might want to add electrolytes, maybe try some liquid IV in my workouts, and maybe I won't get so many cravings if I just up my protein and take a little bit, or I time my carbs a little bit more. So as we go into that luteal phase, we have an increase in metabolism of 100 to 300 calories on average per day. So maybe this is why we crave things. One, because we're metabolizing more fats, maybe this is why we crave chocolate and cheese. And it's not this weird craving because it's comfort foods. I mean, they are, and comfort foods are totally fine and validated, but like, we actually might want them because we metabolize fats more, and those are fatty foods. So it's our body's way of telling us what we want. Imagine that, right? Like, we're not fucking lunatics. And I hate that like that rhetoric has been passed on to women just because we have these changes. It's like, no, it's our physiology, dude. Like, that's it. So we have that increase in metabolism too. So we might actually need more food. So if you feel like you are more hungry, then eat a little bit more. We may need a little bit more protein, but you may also just need to eat a little bit more fats. So this is why we end up having some cravings, and you might negate the cravings a little bit more if you just adjust accordingly. Now, because we are also not as good about metabolizing carbs and utilizing them as fuel, I think there is some research to suggest that eating a little bit of carbs right before you work out, so your body has that for your power, because our strength and power is a little bit less, so we're not as great at like higher intensity things, and our strength training, we're not going to be as powerful. There is some research to support eating a little bit more carbs, simple carbs, like right before we lift and exercise if we're going to do those types of lifts. And I've played around with this, and I can vouch to say that personally, I was having this situation where in my luteal phase, I felt like I had to pull back from exercise so much because my recovery was so poor. I was so weak, and I was just like, I can't lift the same. And I was getting really frustrated. And I did a couple different things. One, I started hydrating more, and because I learned that. And two, I started eating a little bit more carbs right before, in general, right? And then right before I would lift, I would time a little bit more carbs that morning of. So if I was lifting in the afternoon, I'd make sure the morning I would have a little bit more carbs with my breakfast. And then I also started taking creatine, which I took way too long to get on the creatine boat. It's really beneficial for women in like strength training and in higher intensity exercises. And also if you ever go into a diet phase, it helps you retain your fat-free mass or your muscle. So creatine is a really simple thing that you can take. Of course, if you are listening to this, you always have to check with your doctor before taking supplements, but it's one of the most researched supplements and has actually some neuroprotective benefits for our brains and memory and things like that. So there's a lot of really cool stuff they're doing with creatine, and women typically store less of it than men. So the creatine can affect us and help us a little bit more. So those are the three things that I noticed really have helped me in being able to still train at a high intensity, even in my luteal phase. So those are the gist, right, of the two phases, follicular and luteal. We have a little bit of fluctuation and changes during our ovulation. There's some research which is right in the middle, right? That's where we end follicular and begin luteal. Ovulation is when the egg comes down. It's when we're fertile. So this is the time when we can have like a surge of hormones, and sometimes we can get bloated or Sometimes we're less bloated and we're actually a little bit more like confident in ourselves. But it's also when we typically, there is a little bit of research to show that we might have a little more joint laxity and ligamentous laxity. It's been researched in ACLs. And so if you're on your ovulation phase or like that day or around that time, you may just want to be careful with your power or plyometrics or like really heavy strength training or PRs. But there's not enough research to, not conclusive research, and it's not super high quality to support actually making huge changes with that. So just a side note, that is the other the change that we notice. And so I know that like what I said was that basically in our follicular phase when we start our period is like this time when we are stronger, we perform a little bit better, we're more like men hormonally, which really sucks, right? Because not only are we bleeding, we have cramps, and then that's when we're supposed to lift heavy. Not everybody does right on their period, but I have noticed, depending on the people I work with, the 1 to 3 days leading up to their period, during their period, and then the first like 2 weeks of that cycle, so the first 2 weeks of in the follicular phase, that is when they are really strong and we can push the weight and they do really well, even if they don't have all their other ducks in a row as far as taking care of themselves, which reverts back to sleep, stress management, nutrition, making sure we're eating enough calories and protein and carbs, and then hydration. So sometimes we can have a less than ideal focus on those things and still be able to push in that follicular phase. So that is that phase, which, it's a little bit of a buzzkill to have cramps, but what else do you ask for as a woman, right? So that's kind of our general menstrual cycle. Now, we also often have emotional and just general, like, I don't want to say like psychological changes, but like emotional changes and just kind of like how we feel and how we perceive ourselves. That changes and fluctuates for a lot of people as well. Again, I'm going to go back to tracking is really helpful. So I have 2 ways that I track my cycle. One, I have an Aura ring, and they are currently beta testing the ability to predict your period because it tests and tracks your heart rate variability, your sleep, your recovery, and it also tracks your basal body temperature every night. So the temperature has been pretty good and pretty accurate in predicting my period so far. So that is one, but the one that I've used the most consistently for the longest, that has been the most consistent, is my Garmin. I have a Garmin Vivo Active 4S watch, and the Garmin app actually, it will track your period, or it has a calendar, and you can log your symptoms. You can log if you had sex that day. You can log if you ovulated. You can log your discharge, which, by the way, that changes based on where you're at in your cycle. Another thing that nobody wants to talk about, but it happens. So like, we can probably normalize it because it's happening. So let's talk about discharge, but that changes also and is very normal and common. And you can track your symptoms, and then you can also track your moods. There's the word I was looking for earlier. It's mood that I'm looking for. So those all change based on where you're at in your cycle. It's very individualized, and I think it's just really powerful to know your own pattern. Personally, for me, when I start my period, I'm always a little bit, I just feel like not that great, right? Like we start our periods not that great, but then in the follicular phase, I feel like I start to feel a lot more clarity, creativity, like confidence. And then when I ovulate, right before I ovulate is when I feel the most confident. Like I have a surge of confidence. I feel very secure. And I'm like, wow, this is great. And my body image changes as well. Like I'm like, the way that my body looks to me in the mirror is completely different than when I'm going and about to start my period, or I'm in that last week 4, right before luteal phase starts, when I'm PMSing. And there is some changes because I've looked at this and like how my body retains water and things, but it's not quite the difference versus like how I perceive my body to look. And my clothes fit a little differently, and if they fit a little differently, but my emotional reaction is way worse when I am in luteal phase. When I'm in ovulation, I'm not. I'm like really confident. My body doesn't look that way to me. It looks like I'm like, oh yeah, like we look great. Like this all makes sense if you understand the purpose of ovulation. The purpose of ovulation is when we get fertile. Like that's when we're fertile. So we're most likely to get pregnant. Of course, we're going to feel clear and creative and amazing, and we're going to have good body image, and we're going to be confident, because that is Mother Nature's way of telling you, like, now is your time to go get it, girl. Like, go get pregnant. Like, we're trying to procreate. And here's science with sass. But that is kind of like our body's way, or Mother Nature's way of trying to get us to procreate, right? And so right after that, if we don't get pregnant, we go into the luteal phase, where then by week 4, which is personally what happens to me, we are getting into that PMS. And that is when my confidence is really low. My anxiety tends to get a little higher. Depression symptoms can spike a little bit. Those are common. Just feeling less secure, less confident, higher body image issues. We tend to retain a little bit more water. I am always a little bit more bloated during my PMS, during week 4. And so, of course, we're then going to feel like less amazing, which sucks, right? So if we think about this across the time of a month, like month 1, you just feel like trash. You don't want to do anything. Or week 1, and day 1, you just don't feel great because you start your period. But then you're like, oh my gosh, I feel clear. I feel like I can do things and I'm confident. We're going. It's great. And then you reach this peak of confidence. You're like, I'm killing it. And then boom, ovulation gets done and luteal phase hits, depending personally on what's going on in my life. So if I have my ducks in a row with eating enough, moving enough, managing my stress and anxiety, sleeping well, and hydrating enough, luteal phase changes are like minimal. I still will notice them, and I may be a little bit hotter. I sweat a little bit more. I need to cool off or focus on that a little bit more, especially in Florida where I live. But they're negligible. They're not as bad, and I can still perform pretty well in the gym. And that's only because I've done a really big overhaul in my like basic self-care, healthy habit type of work. But if I'm not on par with those things, then as soon as luteal phase hits, I'm just like, I feel like trash. I'm not recovering. I'm crashing. I'm very moody because, again, that's multiple reasons. One, our emotions kind of do change. They get affected by our hormones. But I honestly, and this is like a very biased personal opinion, but I really think the main reason a lot of women struggle so much in their luteal phase is because of 2 reasons. Number 1, we're stressed like crazy because we don't have good stress management, which also affects our sleep. So stress and sleep are not good. Number 2, we are not eating enough. Women are so afraid of food and putting on a little weight that we will make ourselves like so miserable in our luteal phase without realizing it. And this isn't your fault, but this is definitely something I realize. Women are just so afraid of food. I was this way too. I wouldn't eat a ton, but my menstrual cycle got to be a lot better when I started to eat over 100 grams of protein every day. Whether or not I was working out, that was just like bare minimum, and started eating more carbs and stopped being afraid of food. If I am getting into a little bit of a moody situation, or I feel like I cannot concentrate, like I'm reading the same sentence over and over and over again, I used to just get coffee and be like, I'm tired, I'm fatigued, I'm crashing at 3. Do you know how many times I, in the past like couple of years, have switched and instead been like, I'm going to try to eat a carb, not like the typical carbs we think of, which is like pizza and donuts, because those are actually high in fat and carbs, so they're high calories. Like a carb is like some potatoes, some fruit, a banana, something along those lines. If we eat those and give ourselves like a nice nutrient dense meal, sometimes that ends up taking care of it. And all of a sudden now we're not relying on this coffee and caffeine spike that then ends up having us crash even more later. And side note, I believe caffeine also affects our electrolytes as well. So not only are we already dehydrated and needing more electrolytes, then on top of that, we're eating we're drinking caffeine instead of fueling our bodies with something that we need. And so then we're like extra depleting our electrolytes and becoming even more in need of hydration. And so we're kind of in this vicious cycle. Then that late afternoon caffeine is actually fucking with our ability to sleep well. And I'm dropping the F-bomb a lot this podcast. And I'm not even going to apologize. It's just how heated I get about this conversation. So you can see how this really feeds into a big problem. And women are chronically under fueling, and that's something I've noticed, and I talk about it in all of my sessions with women, because we're afraid of putting on weight. But almost all the women that I've talked with who have wanted some sort of body change or something, what they really needed was to lift heavy and actually put some weight on, not actually to lose weight. And even if your ultimate goal would be to lose weight, most women would really benefit from adding like 5 to 10 pounds of muscle mass on them, just because that can help our metabolisms. It helps a lot of things. It helps us function well. It reduces our injuries. It just helps us be able to do the things we want in life. And it's really protective for as we get older. Muscle mass and strength training is like, I think, one of the aging hacks that most people are looking for in a pill form. But it's actually, we need to strength train, and then we need to make sure we're fueling for our strength training. It's hard. I won't pretend it's easy to go through the process of, I really struggle with body image. I don't want to be any larger and larger body. And I am afraid of that and what that really means, because there is so much fat phobia in our world right now. But I have gone up pant sizes so many times. I've gone through a lot of variety of sizes, and I'm still considered a thin woman with a lot of thin privilege to be able to talk about this. But I've gone through a lot of it, and it brings up all of those things. But more days than not, I am really glad that I have more muscle mass, and my cycle responds a little bit better when I'm eating to fuel my body a little bit more. So that's why I kind of went through this. Now, I did put a lot of my own personal experience in there, so take that with what you will. But the thing I really want you to get out of this is start tracking your cycle. If you are, you can use one of the two that I said. You can use your own calendar if you don't want to use your phone for the reasons of everything happening in the US lately with Roe versus Wade. But if you are on birth control, there's an app called Spot On that is recommended by other health professionals. I have never used it. But if you're on birth control and you want to track your own cycle and your fluctuations, even if you don't have a period because you're on birth control, then that's the app that you might want to use and look into. I've heard it's really helpful from people that are very respected and well educated in the industry. So that's the tracking app that is recommended for that. But what I would like for more women to do is start tracking their cycles, get to know your cycle a little bit more, and just pay attention to your mood and performance, and just maybe even like your confidence levels. Just kind of start to notice those things, because maybe next time you won't get so emotional about the changes, because you'll realize it's just something you go through, and it'll help you get a little more clinical, which is really what I want. The last note that I want to say is be very cautious if you are learning about the menstrual cycle on social media, because as much as I am saying we don't normalize the conversation around periods and the menstrual cycle enough, there is now a very big movement of obsessing over the menstrual cycle and thinking that these changes mean that we need to only do yoga on our last week of our cycle, and we need to do endurance training during week 1, strength training during week 2, and like, honestly, that is overcomplicating it. There is no research that actually supports those recommendations. They are extrapolating information and exaggerating results from the data. So be very cautious in the information that you take in. If they're telling you that you need to change your training sessions accordingly, that's a sign that they are not going to be somebody you want to get information from, and you want to look elsewhere. So what the data really does tell us is that maybe we won't be as strong on week 4 of our cycle before we start our periods, and just to expect that, and maybe some dietary changes can help, but for the most part, you're just going to have to meet your body where it is. The luteal phase, that week 4, especially right before your cycle when we're PMSing, I usually tell my people, we just can get away with less. So if you're somebody who doesn't eat enough, or you're just like not sleeping well, you have high stress, then yes, in week 4 specifically, you may want to tone down the amount of weight you're lifting. Think of it as like a deload week for your month. So push really hard in week 1 and 2, even 3 if you can, and then week 4, maybe cut back the volume a little bit if you're not recovering. But if we think about this and you use the same training principles you always do, that's going to be exactly what we do anyways. So the way that I typically educate my clients and those that I work with is we usually operate based off of a concept called rate of perceived exertion, so RPE. I don't get overcomplicated and give people percentages and be at 9.3 RPE for your lifts. I just tell them that most of their lifts, I want it to be about a 7 to 8 RPE. Sometimes we go up to that 9-10 if we're going for a max lift, but almost all of their training is about a 7 to 8. 7 to 8 just means that you have 2 or 3 reps left. Like you could probably do 2 or 3 reps, but it would take everything you had to get those squeezed out. So at a 7 to 8 RPE, all of your lifts are moving pretty much the same speed. If we are going up past that into a 9 or 10, that last rep is probably going to be really slow and you're grinding it out to get there. So if we are using RPE as our like main training tool, then on days that you don't recover, when you're starting to warm up, maybe normally you would warm up and you would do a front squat and your front squat goal is 95 pounds that day, but you warm up with the bar and normally the bar just feels like a 2 out of 10. Sometimes that's what I typically use for RPE is 0 to 10. 0 is like you're laying there, you're not doing absolutely anything. Like that's like a 0-1. A 10 is literal max effort. Like you are trying to lift the car to save somebody's life, like could not give any single more ounce of effort. If we are using that RPE, then when you're not recovered well, suddenly the bar is going to feel way heavier when you're warming up. So as you get up to a heavier weight and you're doing your warm-up sets, you're going to hit that 7 to 8 RPE faster. So you're going to be staying there. You're going to stay at that 7 to 8 RPE, which is going to maybe be at like 80 pounds instead of 95. So that day, your 7 to 8 was 80 pounds, not 95. The reason that we can do this is because we look at a very zoomed out perspective of getting in there and training consistently at a hard enough stimulus. It's not about the weight you're lifting, it's the stimulus and the effort that you put into the exercise. So sometimes we get attached to numbers too much and we really need to pull back and look at like, no, this is what I'm doing. I'm staying consistent with my principles and my goals. I just want this amount of stimulus on my body. If I try to push it, it's usually not worth the risk. So if we're doing that, then naturally when we're not recovered well, so in that week 4, we will pull back the weights and you're already accommodating for it. Now, that doesn't mean that like there's going to be weeks where you just really struggle, or there's going to be women who are like really struggling with their cycle where they do have to pull back a lot on that week 4. I won't say there are not, because there's always going to be somebody who's like, well, I'm different. You're probably not the exception. You're most likely the rule, but I won't invalidate the ones who might have those changes. And if that's you, you have to play around with it. But there's so few people compared to the mass majority that it's not good practice to be educating women to be modifying their lifts and regressing so much during certain times of their cycle. And in a lot of ways, in my opinion, that's another way that we are telling women that they're weak, and we're perpetuating this idea of fragility around women. We already do this enough with women. We do this now when we are in certain parts of our cycle. We've done this way too much about pre and postnatal fitness. So I really don't think this needs to bleed into our menstrual cycles. And yes, if you caught what I did there, you are my people, because that was definitely, that was not planned, but that was pretty cool. I'm giving myself a pat on the back for that. But I don't want this to turn into, and it already has a little bit, but any more so, another reason for women to feel weak and fragile. It's not. Sometimes we are a little bit more under recovered, but it almost always is because we're not hydrating enough and we're not doing, we don't have enough electrolytes, or we're not eating enough carbs and protein and calories in general to fuel ourselves. So yeah, your performance is going to be affected. So basically in that luteal phase, in the very end, you have a smaller margin of error to get away with less self-care. That's how I like to think of it. That's how I'd like more women to think of it, because I think it would help us look at, okay, I'm going to take a little more responsibility rather than play the victim of I have this menstrual cycle, woe to me. Trust me, I validated that in the very first half of this podcast. It fucking sucks. I'm not saying it doesn't, but if we can take a little responsibility and be like, okay, that just means that I need to fuel myself a little bit better, be a little bit more on par with my self-care items. That's what I would like to see a little bit more. So a little bit of knowledge goes a long way. A little bit of knowledge about your own cycle can go even further. So start tracking your cycle and paying attention to it, not because you need to make all these changes in your life, just because maybe it'll help you feel a little more empowered to take the reins on your own cycle and start to just work on a little bit more of your nutrition. Or I would say for a lot of women, it's probably eating more and then stress management and really recognizing how stressed we are. And I've had a lot of podcasts about this, but stress doesn't mean like, oh, I've got this big thing happening, I'm stressed. It's like the tendency to just rush from one thing to another. It's this tendency to be super upregulated and all over the place at all times. It's a lot of things that is kind of perceived as low level chronic grade stress. So some people will be like, I just have a stressed personality, which is that's like a fixed mindset type of thing. You don't want to take on that identity. So if that's you, we probably just need to work on that a little bit more. Just work on your sleep and meeting your body where it is. And then maybe you do have to temporarily kind of reduce some of your training stimulus for 1 week of the month, but you can consider that a deload and you just push the other weeks. But I just think that tracking and understanding your menstrual cycle can be really, really helpful and empowering. So that is why this podcast exists. So hopefully we can leave this podcast, one, talking about our periods a little bit more, normalizing that conversation, realizing that we're not the only ones, and two, starting to understand our cycles a little bit more and tracking them without utilizing it as this reason to only do yoga. By the way, I'm not hating on yoga. I think I say a lot of things. Yoga is great for a lot of different benefits, especially the non-Westernized versions of yoga. It's just that if your goal and if you're trying to strength train, yoga is not strength training. Yoga is a different form of movement that has other benefits. So if you are strength train. And if you want to do yoga, but like don't switch back and forth a lot, or you probably won't make the progress you're looking for in doing one of those things consistently. So that is my little, this was a little 50-minute soapbox for our periods and menstrual cycle. So if you listen to it this far in, thank you so much. I appreciate you. But I really hope that we can start tracking a little bit more and just having conversations about this, because it's really messed up that we live in a society where we just have to suffer in silence. And the amount of stories that I got from women when I brought this up was just an example of how important and needed these conversations are in our lives. And it's our responsibility, right? Men aren't going to do this for us as per usual. We have to kind of force our way to kind of make this more normalized. And for all of the women that come after us, I think it's important for us to kind of pave the way for them to help them in any way, shape, or form make their lives a little bit less burdensome, because the burden that we've carried of these menstrual cycles and trying to show up and operate in a society that has little to no, absolutely no actual wiggle room for us is not really fair. So I'm not going to get into the politics side of that because we are out of time. So with that being said, if you liked this podcast episode, or you love the podcast and you haven't given a review, please go give me a review. It's super helpful, and one of the best ways that you can support this, since I do this without getting paid for it, this is all free information. And if you have somebody that you think would benefit from this information, please share this with them. This was so helpful for me to learn this stuff. So if you can give this to somebody else to help them learn, this is how we spread and make the changes that we want to see in the world. So with that being said, thank you so much, and I will see you in the next episode.